and see if we can't learn something. Chapter 17. Criminal contempt for the law. 1. Defiance of and contempt for the law. Deuteronomy 17, 12 and 13. Numbers 15, 30 and 31. The death penalty is required for anyone who presumptuously breaks the law. Numbers 15:31. The meaning is not that he has only broken a specific law, but denied the validity of God's law. Deuteronomy 17:12 tells us that he has rejected the admonition of the priest as well as of the judge. His offence is twofold. First, he has broken God's law. Second, he has denied the validity of God's law so that he has struck at the very foundation of society. 2. Perversion and obstruction of justice. Exodus 23, 1 and 2, 6 and 7, Leviticus 19... Boy, what a... Point 1 was... Wow. Leviticus 19:15, 35 and 36. The crimes here include repeating baseless rumours, siding with evil men in court to give, in Moffat's translation, quote, malicious evidence, end quote, tampering with justice to destroy a poor man, working to acquit evil men and to condemn, even to death, innocent and guiltless people. Such perversions of justice include favouring the rich or favouring the poor rather than justice. Dishonesty in courts or in commerce works injustice. This makes mandatory justice in the courts and honesty in money and in commerce, honest measures, and hard money, that is gold and or silver. 3. Bribery is forbidden because it works to pervert justice. Exodus 23:8, Deuteronomy 16:19, 27:25. Bribery is spoken of as a kind of murder, Deuteronomy 27:25, and in all these texts as a blinding of justice. It is also a perversion of justice. Partiality to one man or another must not take the place of honest testimony and honest verdicts. 4. Perjury. Deuteronomy 5:20, 19, 16-20, Exodus 20:16, 23:1, Leviticus 19:12. The testimony of witnesses is the key aspect of court proceedings. Without honest testimony there can be no justice. The moral failure of witnesses is basic to the failure of courts. The penalty for perjury is... Hang on a second. What was that? What happened there? Yeah, I just made a bit of a goof. The penalty for perjury. The penalty for perjury. The penalty for perjury is the penalty for the crime of which is the concern. Hang on, that's a bit of involved in it. The penalty for perjury is the penalty for the crime of which is the concern of the court proceedings. If the potential penalty is death, the false witness must die. One of the Ten Commandments is a condemnation of bearing false witness. The reference is essentially to a court of law. Lying in general is secondary. A society without honest courts is soon. A society without honest courts is soon a society without justice. Courts are all ultimately God's courts, whether they recognize him or not. Justice is first of all God's concern because he is righteousness or justice. Where perjury prevails, injustice reigns. 2 of the 10 Commandments are concerned with speech. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, has speech as a concern while having a broader reference, and thou shalt not bear a false witness is also concerned with speech. To cheapen language is to cheapen life. Character and integrity are basic to a godly man and godly society. The cheapening and the vulgarization of language are devastating to life and community. Life and community. The cheapening and the vulgarization of language are devastating to life and community. In decaying Rome, as in the decaying world of the 20th century, language has become less a means of communication and community and more a weapon to cheapen and degrade men and morals. Perjury is a criminal contempt for the law and for God and man. The inclusion of perjury in the list of offences cited for cursing on Mount Ebal, Deuteronomy 27:25, is important because the list is of sins which radically destroy society. All sin is destructive of and is a war against community, and perjury is emphatically such an offence. Deuteronomy 17:12 is especially important because it cites disobedience to the pastoral warning against perjury. How serious it is when pastors do not teach this and other laws of God. They share as a result the guilt that is the lot of an accursed society. In Deuteronomy 27, we see that sins mark such an accursed society. Alrighty. Okie dokie. Yeah. Wow. 1. Restitution. Chapter 18. Punishment. 1. Restitution. Exodus 22:1 following. Depending on the value of whatever is stolen, destroyed, or damaged, restitution could be from death to fivefold. Thus, because oxen were beasts of burden and required much training, and their meat and hide had value, the restitution was fivefold. Sheep, whose wool and meat had value, as do their reproductive capacity, required fourfold restitution. Restitution began with the restoration of what was stolen plus an equivalent amount. 2. In certain offences, it was restoration plus 20%. This applies to cases where something rightly belonging to God was retained or used by someone in ignorance, Leviticus 5:16. This also applied to cases where someone took advantage of a neighbour, restoration plus 20%, Leviticus 6:1-7, Numbers 5:7. 3. The law could not be taken into one's own hands. Leviticus 19:18. We are not God. We have a duty to God to obey His law and to love our neighbour, which means keeping the law in all our dealings with Him, because love does not wrong a neighbour, but observes God's law in dealing with him, for love is the fulfilment, that is, the putting in force of the law, Romans 13:10. 4. In minor offences not requiring restitution, where some kind of punishment is deemed necessary, corporal punishment is required, Deuteronomy 25:1-3. If it be a beating or a whipping, no more than 40 stripes can be given. The offender is not to be degraded, but simply chastised. This law was on the books in many American states well into this century and earlier, commonly applied. 5. No, that's not quite. I didn't capture that. This law was in the books in many American states well into this century and earlier, commonly applied. Hang on a second, maybe I did get it right the first time. This law was on the books in many American states well into this century and earlier, commonly applied. 5. Imprisonment. Leviticus 24:12, Numbers 15:34. Imprisonment was temporary, pending a trial. It was not a means of punishment. After trial, it could be death, restitution, or corporal punishment. 6. The extent of punishment. Leviticus 19, Deuteronomy 24:16. Everyone shall be punished for his own sins. The fathers cannot be punished for their children's sins, nor children for their fathers. If there is complicity. If there is complicity in a family member's sin, if there is complicity in a family member's sin, then there is guilt, but not otherwise. I just had to check something there. 7. No ransom or fine is permitted in cases of murder. Numbers 35, 30 and 31. The death penalty is mandatory in murder cases. In Exodus 21:28, where we have an ox fatally killing someone, in cases other than these, where the owner's ox has been known to be vicious, and therefore both ox and owner must be put to death, Exodus 21:29, a ransom or restitution can be the sentence of the court upon the owner, Exodus 21:30. 8. Other forms of punishment. Leviticus 20:14 and 21:9 prescribe burning. This may have been a cremation after execution. In Leviticus 21:9, it is for a priest's daughter who becomes a prostitute and thereby strikes at her father's office. And in Leviticus 20:14, this death penalty applies to a case where a man commits incest with a wife and her mother. All three are to die. They are to be burned because even the bodies pollute the land. In Deuteronomy 25:11 and 12, a woman who, when her husband is fighting with another man, seizes the other man's genitals to incapacitate it. seizes the other man's genitals to incapacitate him is to have her hand cut out. You should not cut out, he's cut off, man. Cut off. Is to have her hand cut off without compassion. There are unusual cases, and these are. There, yeah. Okay, these. It's these. It's a misprint. These are unusual cases and are intended to stress the evilness of the offence. In Deuteronomy 21:22 and 23, we are told that hanged men cannot remain hanging more than one day. 9. Lex talionis, Exodus 21:24 and 25, Deuteronomy 19:21, Leviticus 24:19 and 20, Numbers 35:33. The eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot formula means that the punishment must fit the crime. The penalties for specific. The penalties for specific offences are routinely given. The lex talionis statements do not stipulate another kind of penalty, but simply sum up the premise of the law that, insofar as possible, restitution must be made or a comparable fine or penalty assessed. From the time of the Greeks to the present, misreadings of the Bible have been prevalent. The perspective of Greek philosophy predisposed men to reduce everything to abstractions and often to read particular statements in their crudest sense. God is the ultimate person and power. He is not an abstraction, but the supreme being and totally personal. His revelation is therefore particular and personal, not abstract. For the Aristotelian. For the Aristotelian and Platonic mind, the Bible is a crude book. For the biblically governed mind. For the biblically governed mind. For the biblically governed mind, the Greek philosophers are airy bubbleheads living in the clouds on the... You slap it up, you. For the Greek philosophers are airy bubbleheads living in the clouds of their own foolish minds. Each to the other appears ridiculous, but the important question is not one of appearance, but of truth. If the God of the Bible is denied, there is nothing. Biblical law tells us that there are consequences to all human action, in time and in eternity. Because there is an ultimate right and wrong, good and evil, there is a heaven and hell. The deterioration of justice in this world follows a denial of justice in the world to come. When man denies the validity of good and evil and the necessity for and the consequences of decisions, then he denies the reality of a future. The future is a consequence of the present. The goal of a static world, the behaviorist. The behavior or antil goal. What is a behaviorist? Goal of a static word, the behavior of until or... That doesn't make sense, does it? Behaviorist. Behaviorist, I'm going to say. The goal of a static world, the behaviorist or until goal of Marxists, socialists and statists, is a futureless world. The views of such a world envision no religion, no morality, no marriage, and no meaning except the acceptance of self as God. To deny God's law is to replace it with man's law, the goal of which is to replace God's justice with man's changing status whims of tyranny. The purpose of God's law is our freedom under God, whereas the purpose of humanistics, I wasn't expecting that. The purpose of God's law is our freedom under God, whereas the purpose of humanistic status laws is freedom from God, but slavery to the state. The insistence of humanism, as in the Humanist Manifesto 1 and 2, is freedom from God. But freedom from God is freedom from life, and freedom, it is freedom for death to reign. To deny the validity of God's law is far worse than denying the validity of medicine and surgery where needed. The society which departs from God's law leaves behind health, healing, and freedom for a license to sin and die. 10. Brutality to a bondservant or slave. Exodus 21:26. If a man angry at a servant struck a male or female servant in such a way that an eye or a tooth were destroyed or comparable damage done, then the servant went free. If a foreigner, their slavery ended. If an Israelite bondservant, the rest of their service was cancelled. 11. The case of death by a goring ox. Hermann Goring. 11. The case of death by a goring ox. Exodus 21:28-32. If the goring ox were not previously known to be dangerous, there was no guilt on the part of the owner. It was an accident. If the ox had a record of being dangerous, both the ox and the owner were to be killed. If the ox injures someone's servants, the compensation to the servant's master must be 30 shekels of silver for each offence. 12. If a thief invades a house at night, he can be killed without liability, but if he be killed without provocation in a daytime break-in, that is manslaughter. The thief must make full restitution. He shall be sold as a bondservant to make restitution. The restitution is to be at least double. Exodus 22:1-4. 13. Borrowed property. Exodus 22:9-15. If a borrowed animal should die without known cause or be taken or driven away without the borrower's complicity, on an oath the borrower is declared innocent. Otherwise, double restitution follows. If negligence has led to theft, then restitution is required, otherwise not. If hired property is injured or broken and the owner is there as a part of that let's cut that off there, different part. Hang on. If hired property is injured or broken and the owner is there as a part of the hire, there is no liability. If a wild animal has killed the borrowed animal, there is no liability. 14. Arson. Exodus 22:6. The penalty is restitution, whether the arson is accidental or malicious. 15. Killing a farm animal. Leviticus 24:8, 21, 18. Leviticus 24:18 and 21. Restitution is required, beast for beast. 16. Removing landmarks. Deuteronomy 19:14, 27:17, Proverbs 23:10. Changing the location of landmarks was a form of stealing land. No penalty is cited, but it invokes God's strong condemnation and curse. 17. Hazardous pits. Exodus 21, 33 and 34. To leave an open pit wherein stray animals can fall is wrong. The owner of the pit shall pay for the dead animal, which then becomes his property for what's becomes his property for whatever value. And try again there, but that was just too abrupt a break. It sounds funny. The owner of the pit shall pay for the dead animal, which then becomes his property for whatever value the hide can bring. 18. Fighting animals. Exodus 21, 35 and 36. If two animals fight and one kills the other, the survivor shall be sold and the proceeds shared for the equivalent amount paid to the owner of the dead animal. If the killer ox had been known to be dangerous and the owner had not kept him in, the owner of the aggressive ox shall pay the owner for the dead ox and take possession of it. 19. Criminal trespasses. Exodus 22:5. Animal trespass could be accidental, a form of animal getting loose. A form of animal getting loose and entering another man's vineyard or fields, or deliberate, turned into the field to get free food. Restitution is mandatory. It should be apparent by now that in most offences restitution is the usual and normal penalty, from double to fivefold usually. With restitution, crime does not pay. The penalty is too great to risk. The penalty is too great to risk. Since no prison system for punishment is a part of biblical law, this means that all serious crimes lead either to the execution of the offender or to restitution. This helps prevent the rise of a class of habitual criminals whose livelihood is crime. What God's law presupposes is that, where obeyed, only the people whose offences are the results of weakness rather than perversity are likely to survive. All right, people. Well, I guess this is the point where I say, if you want to support the work, if you like what I'm doing here, if you want to help me do more better work, you can like, you can share, you can comment, you can give me a wee message, beep, beep. You can even fly to Hanover. Or you can hit me up on the old PayPals, nathanteacher.com, and look for the donate button. Okay, let's get on with the business. Chapter 19, Property. The biblical doctrine of property is very important for us to understand because it is so basic to the knowledge of biblical faith. Neither man, and especially the state, is the owner of this earth. God alone is. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. Psalm 24:1. Not only the world, but we, the people, are God's property. Nice try. Not only the world, but we, the people, are God's property. We are called his sheep. Psalm 95:7, 103, etc. Not a complimentary term. Sheep have no rights as against owners. He is God the Lord, the Creator, and we are the sheep of his pasture. This means that the state has neither title to property nor legitimate power to tax it. We are taxed because of our sins. We have made the state our God and our shepherd. Men prefer the state's tax to God's tithe. The state takes far more of our wealth than does God, but God requires moral responsibility of us. We prefer rather to be taxed and to whine rather than I had to restart the camera there. Than to tithe and be godly. Than to tithe, to tax and to whine, than to tithe and be godly men. The state of property is thus indicative of the moral and religious condition of a people. People are very prone to blame the state for their own moral dereliction. It's no word, it's a nice word. People are very prone to blame the state for their own moral dereliction. Property is a test of character. If we are stewards unto God and accountable to him for our use of wealth, of land, and of his various gifts, we cannot assume that our own ultimacy can be a legitimate position. We are God's property. We are not our own. Land is, in biblical law, that form of property most clearly governed by God's law. The buying and selling of other forms of property was routine. Land was allotted to the tribes, Numbers 26:52-56, and given to their families, Numbers 33:54. The clans could not exchange lands, Numbers 36:2, Joshua 18:2-10. After a disaster such as the exile, there was a reallotment, Ezekiel 45:1-8, 46:16-18, and 47. The Levites received cities and suburbs, lands which could be resold. They had as individuals no inheritance, Numbers 35. Numbers 35, 2-5, Deuteronomy 18:1-2, Joshua 21:3-42. Their service was to be in all the tribes. In ordinary times, the land could not be sold in perpetuity, but only leased. Leviticus 25:23-34, 25:13-16, 27:16-20. The Jubilee was the 50th year when the rural lands reverted to the original owners. The Levites could redeem their urban lands then, but not other urban dwellers. Leviticus 25:30-33. In fact, the Levites could redeem their property at any time by repayment. Leviticus 25:32. The Ten Commandments say clearly, "Thou shalt not steal." Exodus 20:15, Deuteronomy 5:19. Property thus is not a capitalistic invention, but the ordination of God. Property is an instrument and test of responsibility and a test of man's character. It is instrumental in the exercise of dominion. Hang on, this is weird. Every 50th the intent. Okay, this is a part of, this is a page number. Right, okay, that makes sense now. Every unjust social order works to control and or confiscate property, for the control of property becomes the control of man. Capitalism has come to mean the separation of property from God and His law, and this development has led to the decay of capitalism. By undermining the biblical doctrine of property, capitalism has undermined itself. The godless state and the godless corporation are alike in their disregard for the theological meaning of property. Man, together with his family and possessions, is God's property and to be used for His service and glory. If property is separated from God, it is then given to man or to the state. Man, the male, as property owner, has been able in history to prostitute his daughters, his wife, or his sons as their master. The state has used man in a variety of ways, as cannon fodder, a cow to be milked financially, and so on. Only as God's property can people escape. Only as God's property can people escape enslavement. We must remember that the allotment of land was to families, not to isolated, anarchistic individuals. Property is a means whereby godly dominion can be exercised. If we deny to Christian man the mandate to exercise dominion over the earth, we then give to sinful man and the pagan state the power to exercise dominion. For the Christian, it means work. For the anti-Christian, it means theft. The supposed right to expropriate from others in the name of the common good. Some kind of a buzz there. Hang on, what was the buzz? Anybody want to see my phone? What's buzzing? The supposed right to expropriate from others in the name of the common good. Because property is a form of power, ungodly men resent any control of property other than their own. As the self-elected elite philosopher kings, they believe that the world must be governed by their wisdom rather than God's word. God does not share His glory nor law-making power with others, so that, hang on a second, a bit more voluminous. God does not share His glory nor law-making power with others, so that all attempts by man or the state to become the basic owners of property are an affront to God. Many men are quick to see status usurpations of the control of property, but are less willing to see their own transgressions against God. Men have been no less eager to replace God and the state, if not more so. In cases of sales of personal property to one's neighbour, the general rule was to avoid defrauding one's neighbour, Leviticus 25:14. Where loans were involved, no man could take a hand mill or the upper millstone as security for a loan, because this involved taking life in pledge, that is, the means of survival, Deuteronomy 24:6. If a coat were taken as security, it could not be kept overnight because the poor slept with the coat as their covering, Exodus 22, 26 and 27, Deuteronomy 24, 12 and 13. The creditor must not enter a poor man's house to choose the pledge. This shames and degrades him. He must wait for the man to bring an acceptable pledge to him. Exodus. Alokas i Deuteronomy, I say Exodus. Deuteronomy 24, 10 and 11. Alright, thanks very much for tuning in. Most nice to have you all here, virtually in the booth of truth. Virtually, but not really, virtually. So, thanks again, and hope to see you in the following chapters 20.